Okay, good evening, everybody, in this winter evening. We're here tonight to celebrate 40 years of counselling training at the Iron Mill College. It is worth noting that the Iron Mill College opened less than 5 years after the establishment of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, and it is one of the very few colleges in the UK to consistently offer counselling training over a 40-year period. Those 40 years have seen our counsellors support the development of human rights for many marginalised groups and adapt to enormous innovations in technology, as well as sitting quietly beside sorrow and suffering. In welcoming everyone here tonight, I want to give a warm expression of gratitude to all of our colleagues, students and supporters who have made those past 40 years possible. As we approach the end of 2021, and the world opens up to new horizons, I would like to announce the opening of our own new venue and new degree programme in counselling in Poole. I also want to pay special tribute to Rose Bedford, who has been the driving force in the expansion of the college for the past 12 years. A lady of wisdom, infinite grace and great kindness. Rose is now leaving the college and we wish her all the very best for her future pursuits. And speaking of new horizons, as well as the achievements of counselling, leads seamlessly into the introduction of our guest speaker. Tonight, our Ruby Anniversary Lecture is being given by Nick Totton, whose own career in counselling has also incredibly spanned the last 40 years. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to introduce the prolific, the poetic, the political and the philosophical Nick Totton. Anyone who attends any of my classes will know I always sneak in a little article called Boundaries and Boundlessness, written by Nick over 10 years ago. An article which, like good whiskey, never dates and always seems more rich and relevant as each year passes. It speaks to his great wisdom that such tiny gems stand alongside some of his more recognised works, such as Wild Therapy, now in its second edition. For in Nick's writings, we find an author of anthologies of poetry, an advocate of embodied psychotherapy, and a champion of ecotherapy. As we emerge from a pandemic, to misquote Auden, in an uncertain and afraid time, and as the clever hopes expire, it is a chorus of voices from someone like Nick Totton that seek to undo the folded lies. I do hope Nick will excuse me for only adding a few lines of his own poetic words to this quote. With an intriguing title of My Crystal Ball is Cracked, Alternative Futures for Counselling and Therapy, on behalf of the Iron Mill College, I welcome and thank Nick Totton for bringing us the Iron Mill's 40th anniversary lecture. This event will now start to be recorded, and at the end of Nick's lecture, the recording will be put off again so that you can ask Nick questions. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Marilyn. I hope I can live up to your enthusiastic introduction.
You can.
So, yes, it's being recorded, which wasn't part of the deal when you signed up for it. And so that's why you're muted for the next hour. It's not because we don't want to hear from you, but we will have plenty of time for conversation and questions at the end. And if you want to put any questions or points on chat in the meantime, then please do, and we'll consult those at the end. I get very confused if I try to watch chat at the same time as giving a talk, so I'm not even going to try. They'll all be there. It's very nice to see you all, and there's an awful lot of people here I've never met before, which is always a bonus. As you know, I'm going to be. I've got notes written down here. I much prefer to actually improvise when I'm giving a talk, but this topic feels sufficiently complex that I don't really trust myself to remember what I want to say entirely without notes. So I have got some notes here, and you'll occasionally see me having a look at them. As you know, I'm here to talk about the future of psychotherapy and counselling, and I'm not going to keep saying psychotherapy and counselling, which is a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to refer to them jointly as therapy. It's an interesting starting point, isn't it, if we're talking about cracks and splits in the therapy world. The split between psychotherapy and counselling is a very good one to begin with. I've actually never called myself a counsellor, but although a lot of my clients do, and isn't that interesting, that they feel more comfortable coming to see a counsellor than seeing a psychotherapist. But I don't think anybody has yet in all these years managed to actually define the difference between psychotherapy and counselling. The best attempt I've seen was Wendy Dryden, who said that the difference was about £20,000 a year. In terms of content, I know many psychotherapists who work in a quite shallow way, to use the terminology, and a lot of counsellors who work in a very deep way. There is no obvious way to make a distinction. And yet we have such loyalty to the label we were given in our training. It's very interesting. But the future of psychotherapy and counselling, what's immediately apparent, I think, is that there's no single future path for therapy, but at least two alternative and radically different paths. So my intention is to try to describe what these alternative paths are, to point out the crucial differences, and to argue for choosing one rather than the other. In all of this, I want to hold the image of a crack in the practice of our craft, and to keep open the question of whether or not this is a crack through which the light gets in. To understand our possible futures, I suggest that we need to look first at our history. And one of the odd features of therapy world is that we pay enormous attention to our clients' histories, but very little attention to the history of our profession. I find that many practitioners know very little, even about the history of their own modality, let alone about the wider history of therapy. I've come across a number of people who don't know who founded their training school, or where they came from, or how it happened. Many practitioners, I find, have actually taken on crude myths about the failings of modalities other than their own. In particular, psychodynamic practitioners about humanistic ones, and humanistic about psychodynamic. In both cases, the ways in which people describe the other modality are often cartoony and completely unrealistic. But again, as I was saying about psychotherapy and counselling, I think there's far more in common between good practitioners in both modes than there is difference. I'm only mentioning this in passing. The split or crack, which I want to identify, is a different one. And I can approach it historically by pointing out that right from its origins, therapy has always been concerned with the tension between the goals and desires of the individual and the goals and requirements of society. This was Freud's starting point, that there is a clash, a major clash between what we as individuals want and need and what society expects of us. He suggested that compromise was required on both sides, but also made it clear that in his view, society very much oppresses its members. Psychoanalysis very soon split between the left Freudians, as they were called, who saw their work as addressing social justice, and the more conservative analysts who focused on the individual's need to adapt to social conventions. And over the century or so which has followed, therapies oscillated strongly between these two positions. And generally speaking, it's followed the shifts in the wider culture. For example, in the 1950s mainstream American culture, there was an extremely conservative tone and intolerance of nonconformity. Therapists very much mirrored this, with a constant emphasis on adjustments to social norms, and defined nonconformity as a mental health problem. Ironically, in this, they were very similar to their equivalents in the United States' great opponent, the Soviet Union, where again, nonconformity was defined as a mental illness and people were locked up in asylums for opposing the state line. Things were a little bit more nuanced in the United States, but basically it was the same. But in the 1960s, the huge wave of countercultural upheaval influenced many therapists to abandon adjustment and focus on individual freedom and creativity. We can see it in the work of Rogers, Pearls, Byrne, and many others. Eric Byrne, for example, wrote, "Parents, deliberately or unaware, teach their children from birth how to behave, think, feel, and perceive. Liberation from these influences is no easy matter." That quote can stand for many others. It was an extraordinary shift that happened in a period of just a few years. Suddenly everybody was talking about liberation from social influences rather than conformity with them. And later on, as society shifted towards a new emphasis on regulation and safety, the therapy shifted with it. So where does therapy stand now in relation to these issues? What is striking to me is that there are powerful voices and skillful practice on both sides of the issue. Which is why my title today is "My Crystal Ball is Cracked." It feels impossible at this point to tell who will win the argument, which future will actually happen. But before I come back to that question, I want to look from a different angle at what this argument is about. And I think this different angle enriches rather than contradicts what I've been saying about the ongoing theme of individual versus society. The current argument, the way it's posed, the terms in which it's made, I suggest, is between two ways of doing psychotherapy, which I've described as the expert systems approach on the one hand, and the local knowledge approach on the other hand. I've taken these terms from sociology of science and philosophy of science, where they're widely used. In this context, expert system psychotherapy, the more recent arrival on the scene, has evolved to cope with an environment which demands expertise. Expertise which is demonstrated partly through formal qualifications and partly through quantified research into outcomes and effectiveness. This is an environment also in which both clients and purchasers are demanding, are encouraged to demand maximum amelioration of distress in minimum time. As we all know, a number of people come to therapy essentially saying, "Fix me quickly." There's a widespread view that actually it's a bad thing if you get dependent on therapy and you have to get in and out as fast as you possibly can to avoid getting tied there forever. Like the sirens on the rocks, you know, that Odysseus had to be tied to the mast to avoid. So therapy is something, in that point of view, that we may sometimes need to do, but it's quite a dangerous experience, and we have to be very careful not to do it for too long. And anyway, you know, time is money, And who can afford to see a therapist every week for a few years? So the appropriate customers of expert systems therapy are people whose interests don't happen to include self-knowledge and psychological exploration. As therapist Arnold Mindell puts it, they aren't members of the growers club, the club of people who are just inherently interested in self-development. These are individuals with other equally valid focuses to their lives who simply want to be able to get on with things. In other words, people who find it easy or want to find it easy to fit into society. And if they find that they're not fitting in because they get stressed out in their job or because they find themselves bursting into tears or because they get chronic stress-related illnesses, then they want to be fixed. And I'm in no way wanting to put this point of view down or to say it's not valid. It is. It's not what therapy has traditionally been about, but it is one function that it's found it can serve quite effectively. So expert systems therapy, therefore, is a lean, mean evolutionary machine which avoids detours and distractions and privileges symptom removal over the uncovering of meaning. Its practitioners are often enormously skillful at what they do by virtue of their tight and creative focus on effective technique. What I'm calling local knowledge psychotherapy, on the other hand, has evolved in a very different world, one in which clients, usually self-financing, have chosen to seek, alongside and even sometimes in preference to symptom removal, understanding of their symptoms, placing them within the wider context of their life as a whole, their family and social networks, the entire social and cultural framework, and indeed human existence in general. Local knowledge therapy is in this sense anything but local. The name, borrowed from sociology and anthropology, refers to a reliance on intuition and accumulated wisdom in preference to technique and research, an emphasis on self-knowledge for both practitioner and client. Increasingly prominent in the local knowledge approach is an emphasis on the therapeutic relationship as the medium of change. I think we're all aware of the turn to relationality that's been happening in psychotherapy over the last 10 or 20 years. And for me, it's one of the most important things that's happened. It's brought into the foreground, if you like, things that have always already been going on in psychotherapy. It's not as if people haven't been working with the relationship. It's not as if successful therapy hasn't always just depended on a successful relationship, but it's become foregrounded and it's become acknowledged as perhaps the most important factor in our work, and also the means by which the work is conducted increasingly. You know, people come to therapy mainly, not always, but mainly because of problems in their relationships with people. But the only relationship of theirs that we actually can experience directly is the one with us. So if we try to ignore that and talk exclusively about their relationships with other people in the third person, we're actually ignoring our primary source of information. That, anyway, is the approach of local knowledge psychotherapy. And clearly, it's enormously privileged in what it does in terms of available resources and the pace at which it's therefore possible to work. Since the therapists are self-financing, they have to charge. They have to charge a fairly substantial amount for their time, not for the work they do, but for their time. And there are opportunities to get funded, but they're somewhat limited. Expert systems therapy, on the other hand, operates at a point of convergence between clients who often want to avoid dependence on their therapist and return as fast as possible to a state of ordinary functioning, and service providers who need quick and cost-effective ways of restoring their users as fast as possible to a state of ordinary functioning. No one in this context is in a position to question what exactly ordinary functioning implies. Ordinary functioning is essentially fitting in with the requirements of capitalism, the requirements of the state, and the requirements of social convention. Local knowledge psychotherapy, by virtue of its privileged situation, is able to ask questions like this, questions about what ordinary functioning means. It's able, for example, to use the values and understandings of psychotherapy as a measure against which ideas of ordinary functioning and other social norms and standards can be critiqued. Many psychotherapists feel that the sort of unhappiness which they see in their clients are largely the creation of the dominant social order, often mediated through the family. That it is the way in which we all live, together, of course, with the difficulties which are inherent in embodied existence, that make us ill. If this is our understanding of things, then as therapists, we're necessarily humble about our own function. We don't see ourselves as experts who can fix things. We see ourselves as fallible human beings who can maybe help it a bit, help make it a bit easier for things to sort themselves out, but who recognize the inherent limitations of a situation where we are expected to act in ways that may not suit us. At the extreme end, there's the familiar situation which probably most therapists experience, where we think, what this person needs most is not therapy. It's a house which isn't damp and isn't noisy, and I can't provide them with a good place to live. And so, as a therapist, I'm simply saying, well, cheer up. It's not as bad as all that. I can't change your situation. But why don't you try to be more positive about it? Which in the extreme can be insulting. The function of local knowledge therapy, although we feel humble about it, as I was saying, is nonetheless real and important, but very different, I suggest, from the function of expert systems psychotherapy, which is explicitly to help people deal with the effects of the ways in which we live, or the effects of their brain chemistries, or the effects of their poor strategic choices, depending on which paradigm one uses. But note that holding brain chemistries or poor choices responsible assumes the social context. As conservative points of view of all kinds almost always do, they assume that the way things are is natural, which is a major limitation if we're trying to understand fully why people are experiencing problems in their lives. All we can do if we assume that the context is natural and as it should be, is to hold them responsible. So expert system psychotherapy employs a considerable range of techniques to help clients manage their distress, ideally to such an extent that they no longer experience that distress, although it may still be affecting them, and are able to operate successfully according to their own conscious preferences. And that in some ways is a key point in distinguishing the two kinds of work I'm talking about. That expert systems therapy is fundamentally customer driven, as you might say, in the sense that it does work with people's conscious preferences. It assumes that what we actually know we want is what we deeply want. Whereas local knowledge therapy knows from experience that it's more complex than that, and that we can have all sorts of different conflicting needs and desires going on in us, only a few of which are conscious. And that our symptoms, for example, in the widest sense of symptoms, are what interrupts our conscious understanding of ourselves, our conscious narrative of who we are and what's going on. It's what trips us up and says, no, hang on, you haven't got the whole story here. You have to consult me as well. But the goal of helping people match their conscious preferences is clearly an important and respectable and comprehensible one. It's in no way absurd, whereas the goal of local knowledge psychotherapy is much harder to articulate, which is perhaps one reason why the situation has become so confusing. One thing I suggest about local knowledge psychotherapy is that this way of working is not actually about helping people. Oh my God. Or rather, paradoxically, it knows that in order to be helpful, it has to avoid, so far as possible, actually helping. If we try to help people, we've thrown our lot in with what they consciously want. We're no longer able to sit back and observe what the process actually is, what's actually coming up, what's being said in the background, what's being said under their breath, what's being expressed in the pauses and the expressions on the face and the trips and the slips and all the rest of it. I suggest that local knowledge psychotherapy in all its many forms and subforms is above all a practice of truth, which aims to study and understand what is actually going on in the client and in their past and present life and in the consulting room. Within this paradigm, for the therapist to attempt direct helping is to abandon the project of understanding, at least temporarily, and often with long-term damage to that project. A helper identifies with a particular point of view, and this identification works against wider understanding. By the way, I'm certainly not saying that we don't at times help our clients in all sorts of ways, because we're human beings. And if being a therapist is less than being a human being, it's worthless. It needs to be something extra, not something less. So, you know, a client comes in having had an exhausting journey, I offer them a cup of tea. Freud once realized that his patient hadn't eaten all day, so he invited him to stay for dinner. Freud, who is supposed to be the epitome of the non-relational therapist, he was anything but, I must say. But of course, in all sorts of ways, we help therapists, but we help clients. But that's not our job. That's not the center of what we're doing. It's something which happens around the edges, and which is actually, if we didn't do it, we'd be identifying ourselves as peculiarly cold and unfeeling people, which is probably not the most helpful thing to do. But the center of our work is understanding. It's a practice of truth, not a practice of helping. It's not, in fact, a helping profession. I could say a lot more about all this, but I'll try to wrench myself back to the immediate topic. What's the future then for the relationship of the two approaches I'm describing? When I spoke earlier of two alternative futures, I didn't actually mean a choice between expert systems or local knowledge, because actually that's not a realistic possibility. The expert systems approach vastly outguns the local knowledge one, let's face it, because it's backed by three powerful and interlocked forces: capitalism, the state, and the currently dominant culture. There's no way that expert systems therapy is suddenly going to go away. So the two alternatives, it seems to me, are either expert systems therapy gains something close to a monopoly, or the two approaches find a way to coexist. In preparing this talk, I came across something I wrote back in 2008, at the point where it looked as though therapy was almost certain to become regulated by the state, something that I think would have really disastrous consequences. We somehow managed to win that battle, but the forces which support regulation are still strong and tireless. So here's the piece, which was published as an editorial in the journal Psychotherapy and Politics International. It's called Looking Back. You'll see that the dates it gives were over pessimistic, because at that point it looked as though the whole game was over. So, looking back, it was in 2023 that traditional therapy and counselling finally became illegal under the new Social Fraud Act, leaving new therapy in command of the field. Looking back, this had probably been inevitable since the state regulation of psychotherapy and counselling in 2014. Once the state took on the job of policing therapy, its definition of what was acceptable was bound to become increasingly draconian, as therapy was adjusted to fit concepts and standards which the civil service could comprehend and administer. Perhaps Procrustean is a better word than draconian. Gradually, all the bits of traditional therapy which could not readily be assessed or measured were lopped off, while simultaneously therapy was stretched to accommodate the tasks which the state assigned to it. After the definition of successful therapeutic outcome was settled on as satisfaction of the client with their life, career, and relationship status as it presently exists, the rest was inevitable. All of the required competencies of new therapy tumbled into place, from psychopharmacy to neuropsychology. In practice, of course, the requirement for both new therapists and clients to fill in forms at the start and end of each session, as well as after each moment of insight, meant there was seldom time for the competencies to be exercised. However, this gave assurance that the competencies would not be exercised abusively, and the installation of CCTV cameras in every consulting room guaranteed that new therapy was fully safe, while confidentiality was preserved by the fact that because of financial constraints, no one was actually watching the CCTV footage, and only a software program was analysing the audio for danger words like bomb, unconscious, or desire. The regulatory process was complemented by an ongoing redefinition of mental health, but perhaps best illustrated by the appearance in 2022's DSM-6 of new psychopathologies like climate change neurosis, characterized by a phobic reaction to our wonderful new 100-degree summers and slug-killing 30-degree winters, -30 winters, Social misalignment syndrome, easily identified by unhappiness about anything, and religious mania, for example, being a practicing Muslim. A generation of young new therapists were trained, dedicated to helping their clients fit in, whatever the cost. As usual, the United States blazed the trail, following the publication of a huge body of new material on AVCT, augmented view changing technique, popularly known as Guantanamo 2. So what happened to the discredited traditional therapists? Some of them had been more or less underground since the later 2010s, changing their name to psychological helper, emotional supporter, or some other dubious term, before this option was removed by the Act of 2023. A very few served prison terms for illegal use of protected titles, or later for illegal practice of discredited techniques. But the great majority either silently retired or adapted to new therapy, demonstrating, as the state saw it, the feebleness and fraudulence of their practice. If they were not even prepared to stand up for the value of their own work, then why should anyone else take them seriously? In 2025, of course, the revolution began. So as you will have gathered, when I wrote this piece, I was in no mood for compromise or mutual understanding. I was getting something off my chest when it seemed as though local knowledge therapy had its back to the wall. In some ways, the situation now seems less stark. In particular, I'm constantly encouraged by the wisdom and maturity of many trainees and new practitioners, and the strong values held by quite a number of trainings. The fact remains, though, in my opinion, that the practice of psychotherapy and counselling has been deeply warped and twisted by the culture which hosts it. In this, interestingly, therapy resembles its clients and is involved in a parallel struggle for authenticity and freedom. I think for me, one example of this, something which I think represents a corruption of therapy, even in terms of expert systems therapy, is the way in which newly qualified trainees are expected to work for free or even at some cost to themselves for a considerable length of time in order to get their hours in. It's not something for which any individual is to blame or any particular structure is to blame, but it's become the norm. And of course, what it means is that it makes it possible for agencies to operate because they're not having to pay the therapists to do the work. However, it seems to me that there's a really simple either or here. Either the newly qualified therapists are competent to work with these clients, in which case they should be paid, or they're not competent, in which case they shouldn't be doing it. I can't see any way of squaring that circle. And yet it's enormously convenient. And it ends up with a sort of inverted pyramid in the therapy world, whereby the least experienced therapists are working with the most demanding clients, with the most complex clients, while the most experienced therapists are mostly charging quite a lot of money to work with mildly unhappy or slightly disturbed individuals. It's a crazy situation, and yet the craziness of it is invisible to an awful lot of people. It's not invisible to a fair number of trainees who are subjected to it. But as with medical training, you know, it's horrible, absolutely horrible while you're doing it, while you're being a junior doctor. But once you've come through, it becomes a sort of rite of passage. And you take the kind of public school attitude of, well, it didn't do me any harm, it was the making of me, and if it was done to me, it should be done to other people as well. And yet it doesn't make any sense at all. That was a digression, as you will have noticed. I do feel that the best future for therapy lies in compromise, but a certain kind of compromise, not compromise over values. The two species of therapy are too far apart for that. But compromise in the sense of recognizing each other's valid right to exist, and that each approach will be of use to certain clients and useless to others. Over 40 years, I've learned to recognize the clients who come to me looking for something that I simply can't supply, looking to be fixed. They're the kind of clients who want homework generally, who want bullet points, who want answers to problems that are inherent in the way life is organized, and sometimes inherent in the fact of life altogether. I remember one client who I did actually end up working with for a number of years, but the first 6 months were a constant struggle, because she actually believed and said explicitly that I knew what she needed to do, but I wasn't telling her. I was refusing to tell her because of some strange notion of my own that she had to work it out for herself. So she was convinced I was actually withholding answers from her. And it didn't matter how often I said I didn't have any answers. And of course, you know, it's just a more specific version of a very general feeling that a lot of us have, that answers exist. You know, a problem that many people have in making life decisions really seems very often to be based on the idea that there is somewhere an angel with a book in which what we're supposed to do has been written down. And we somehow have to work out what that is. Then we'll do it and everything will be all right. That's not what decisions are. A decision is a realization of what deeply feels right to us at the moment. It guarantees nothing. It in no way prevents us from being knocked over by a bus when we leave the room, or losing all our money on a bad venture. So many people come to therapy looking for that book and regarding us as that angel. And there are some forms of therapy, as I've been saying, which act into that expectation. And other forms of therapy which resist it, try to make it explicit, try to help the client reach a point where they're no longer looking for that sort of response from us. So those clients don't actually want the kind of therapy that the local knowledge therapists are offering. And there's no point in pretending otherwise. It's not our job to kind of make people submit to something which is not what they're looking for. It's our job to work with the many people who actually have a sense that there's something about the way they're organizing their lives that they don't understand, and who want to try to be open to understanding better what's going on, and why the sorts of difficulties they experience arise. So that's the basis, as I see it, for a compromise, for a peaceful coexistence between the two approaches. And of course, you know, it's not two approaches, it's a huge spectrum of approaches stretched between these two major poles that I'm identifying. And all of us at some moments find ourselves operating in a different mode from our preferred one. If we're any good at all as any kind of therapist, we automatically respond to the client we have in the room with us. We work differently with this person and differently with that person. So there's a range of ways of practicing even in ourselves. But peaceful coexistence feels particularly important at the moment, given the enormous crises that now face us as a species, as a society, and the huge demands that this will place on practitioners as more and more people come to realize just how grim our probable future is. I'm talking, of course, about climate change, about environmental collapse, something which psychotherapy and counselling have largely put off addressing over the years. And it's not going to be possible for that much longer, I suggest, because increasingly people are going to come to us out of a deep distress about what's happening in the world, out of grief, out of fear, out of anger. And we are going to have to find ways of addressing that. And it's something that's very difficult to actually reduce to a personal problem, to treat as an aberration. It's been treated in that way in the past, you know, when it wasn't so much upfront and in our faces. Oh, when you talk about climate change, you're really talking about your unhappy childhood. It's been said a lot, and there are still therapists who are gamely trying to play that card, to hold that argument. I don't think it's going to work that much longer. So we need to get our act together as therapists. And a part of that, I think, is finding a way of a form of peaceful coexistence between expert systems therapy and local knowledge therapy, where the regulators and the controllers, and the therapy police, actually make a decision to leave us alone, to get on with our own form of practice. The crack in therapy is only one of many cracks that are opening up in our society. So let's hope that at least some of them turn out to be how the light gets in.